So howdy, folks. Happy New Year to all of you, and welcome to the January 2025 edition of Cattle Trails Showcase. I'm Ron Wilson, Poet Laureate. Glad to be your host. The purpose of the Cattle Trails Showcase is to continually highlight the communities, historical elements, museums, and other attractions along the historic cattle trails. And Lonnie Steben, seen on your screen, is our showcase chair. Uh, the Cattle Trails Showcase was really initiated 4 years ago as a monthly initiative by the International Chisholm Trail Association, and now is a project of the Cattle Trails Consortium, which seeks to promote all of the historic cattle trails. The Chisholm Trail, the Western Trail, sometimes known as the Great Western, the Shawnee Trail, and the Goodnight-Loving Trails. And so each month, we look forward to highlighting attractions and information about these historic cattle trails, all of which played a significant role in the history of the American West. So today we're going to hear about a particular area of the Goodnight-Loving Trail, and from a standpoint that combines archaeology, actual artifacts, and history. Tom Ashmore is our speaker. Tom has spent 22 years in the Air Force as a special intelligence analyst in the past. After retiring from active duty, he taught intelligence schools for another 20 years for the Air Force, teaching special intelligence at the Air Force School at Goodfellow Air Force Base in Texas. He's worked closely with the Texas Archaeological Society for many, many years. Thanks, Bob Saul, for helping make this connection. And he's headed up several archaeological investigations. In 2019, he completed a book on his Butterfield Trail, Butterfield, also known as Goodnight-Loving. The book is titled The Butterfield Trail Through the Concho Valley in West Texas. He's a board member of the Southwest Federation of Archaeological Societies and is currently president of the West Texas Archaeological Society. Tom, we look forward to hearing from you, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Do you want me to get started right away, or do you have a business?
Go right ahead. Go right ahead.
Okay, I'll share the screen here, and we'll get started. All right, can everybody see this? Are we good?
Perfect.
All right, so as he said, I'm president of the West Texas Archaeological Society. I've been studying the Butterfield Trail for 17 years now of this section of Texas. And what many people don't realize is that the Butterfield Trail and the Goodnight-Loving Trail was the same thing. What happened was the Goodnight-Loving were looking for a way to make more money than they were going to get if they were going to drive up to Kansas. And they heard about a couple of drives that went this direction to New Mexico, and decided that that would be the way to go. And they didn't know the way, but they did know that the Butterfield Trail went all the way up to New Mexico, and then it would be an easy continuation to go on up the Pecos to get to Fort Sumner. So on the right side of your screen, this is the area that I'm talking about. The red there is the area that I've worked for a long, long time of the Butterfield Trail. And then for this presentation, I've added the other section here going up through New Mexico. So just a little bit more about myself. I'm the official historian and guide for the Horsehead Crossing on the Pecos River. We've been doing events there for 5 years on an annual basis, a large gathering of reenactors and chuck wagons, big event, and I'd give walking tours and presentations of the history from all the work that I've done out there. I've rediscovered 5 lost stations on this section of the trail. In fact, I've just recently found 2 more that we'll be working on soon. To get started, I thought I'd give you a little bit of background on how I do what I do. As he said, I was in the Air Force doing intelligence, and I worked with satellite imagery quite a bit. And then I naturally went over to Google Earth when it started coming in and started checking to see if I could find these trails from around where I live. And in fact, I was able to do that because I started with the Fort Chadburn, and we did many archaeology projects rebuilding that fort, and that was where one of the stagecoach stations was. So it was easy to follow from that station down to the next station and just using research documents of where to go, and then found the trail. And this is how I'm able to follow these trails. You can see here, they make a depression from use over and over and over again. It gets abandoned, it gets filled in, water seeps into it, and then you get a different kind of a growth into those trails. So that can be seen from satellite imagery if you know what you're looking for. So on the ground, you can see on the left side here, here's two examples. One of these is one that I am working on actually right now. And you can see this deep impression here of the old trail. That's one way of seeing it. And this one here, you can see where the grass in the depression has grown different than everything else around it. So that's how we can see the trail from the ground. And on the other image here, this is part of the Butterfield Trail coming across West Texas, and you can see this dark line, and that's where the bushes have grown into that particular trail in this section here. And so I've learned over all these years how to follow this trail. You have to know where to start and where to end so you don't get pulled off on ranch roads or fence lines, or in this case, oil field roads. So it takes a while to learn how to do this, but I've gotten pretty good at it lately. We're going to start at an area near my home. It's about 13 miles away from where I live, and this was my first project. It was Johnson Station on the Middle Concho River. You can see these two maps here is where we're talking about, where the stars are. And this picture is the actual location of the old Johnson Station that I worked for 6 months to understand this location. I put in an image of, there was at the time an abandoned cabin that was from the old station. So I just kind of put that into so you could see what it looked like. And this is some of the images from the work that we did. This, like I said, it was a 6-month excavation project. You can see in the bottom right side all the flagging that's in the field here. So we do a lot of our work with metal detecting for this historic type of archaeology. And these piles here are brush piles that were piled up by the landowner to clear the land. And we are taking stuff from those brush piles and going through it and sifting and looking for artifacts and stuff. Just good image of the land here. So you can see there's nothing left on the surface of the land. You have to be able to find these stations by following the trail, the distances, and then looking for something that would indicate that there was a cabin or a compound or something like that prior, and that is seen through the vegetation because it always grows back differently. So from the results of this one, we were able to determine that it was the Butterfield Station for all that time before the Civil War, and then it was abandoned. Then the Fort Chadburn Cavalry made it their permanent camp, and the permanent camp was they were sent down there to escort the cattle drives from that location over to the Pecos River. And they had to stay there and rotate units, detachments out of that to go up and down, and then they would rotate from the fort a new detachment would come in, but it became a permanent camp. So the cattle drives were there, waiting for their escorts from the 1866 on, and it was a rest stop for them. It was a rest stop for Goodnight-Loving before any of this escort duty happened. Then Fort Chadbourne actually closed down and it moved to Fort Concho here in San Angelo. And they continued doing the escort duty from this particular camp. Later, buffalo hunters came in. There was a large buffalo herd going along the river there, the Middle Concho River, and they also made the camp there. And then we finally have the ranching operation, 1889. I went and met with the owner. He had grown up there his whole life, he said, and I asked if I could look around because I thought he had a station there. And he said, well, you can look, but I've been here my whole life and I can tell you there's nothing out there. And I found it within 2 hours. So even people who live on their own property their whole lives sometimes don't even know that these things are there. And this is the location. And what I wanted to show you here is just one example of the determination of how we know that this was military camp. This is what the Butterfield Road came in here. And this other road is the Fort Stockton El Paso Mail Road. It was also called the Grierson shortcut. So Colonel Grierson at Fort Concho made a shortcut because the Butterfield Trail ran along the river and he wanted to get a straighter line, and this is 1876. So these are the two different trails coming into this location. And you can see here that we have 4570 cartridges annotated here. And these are the picket stations that they set up for guarding their camp while the military was here at the time. And over in the right top corner here, I think you can see one of those lines in the ground here, right there, which is the trail coming in. And there was it's kind of blocked out by the everybody's picture, but there's also a trail coming in over here on the right, and there's trails coming down to this location. So we worked this 6 months, and I'll show you some of the artifacts to kind of validate what it was. On the left side here, you can see Johnson Station archaeological artifacts. We have cartridges that were proper to the time frame of Fort Chadbourne. And we have 1858 canteen that came off one of those brush piles that got pushed up. They didn't even know they had it there. And some tack and some knapsack bands and stuff like that. Then over in the Fort Concho period, we have more stuff here. This is a Confederate curry comb. When the Civil War was over, of course, all the stockpiles of the Confederacy were moved into the Union warehouses, and they continued to use those kinds of things if they had them. We have the 4570, which is proper period time of Fort Concho. We have tin cans. There's an entire archaeology study of tin cans where you can actually tell what the period of time is from the way that they were constructed. And this is 1870 to 1880 ration can. And we have a 10-gauge shot shell, which was used by the military. Each military detachment would usually have one person with a shotgun for close-in battles if they got into it. So they had 40 soldiers there at any one time, and they were actually escorting the trail drives from this location because the Indian problem was so serious. So on to the Goodnight part. They weren't the very first ones to run this trail, but when they came back and everybody heard they had made so much money at this, and it was successful, that, and they were going back and they did it over and over again, and they were well known through all of the cattlemen up in their area. They just naturally took on the name of Goodnight and Loving. So they continued down the trail to the Pecos River. Here is an overhead of the actual trail along the area that I just mentioned. Over on the right is Johnson Station, and they would go about 10 miles in one day and look for good water. Although they were along the river is not good for human consumption. It was okay for the cattle, but they're not good for humans. So it was also a good thing to follow the Butterfield Trail, because they would end up at the different stations that had been abandoned. But the reason those stations were created was because they had, as well as water for the animals, they had water for people that was safe to drink, usually coming out of a spring or a creek instead of the river. And here's where the intermediate spot would have been for them to stop. Is a good creek area. Over here is Mather Station. So it's 9 miles, 9 miles. Nice, easy day's ride. As they got towards a more difficult area, they were just taking it easy. Continuing on, they came to what is called Kiowa Creek. And this is well known even today for being a good creek. Nice clean water at the time. Would have been a good stopping point, because the next one was 10 miles to get to the abandoned station down here called Head of the Concho Station. So this is the beginning of the Middle Concho River. From this point on to the west, there was no water for quite a distance. You can see here's where they located. So Johnson Station and then Head of the Concho. You can see they were pretty well tightened up between the river and the hills to the north there. From the Head of the Concho, they had 75 miles to cross without any water. So they learned very quickly that they had to keep moving without stopping, because if they stopped, the animals would just lay down and not go any farther. They would just lay down and die. And so they had to keep them moving, and they forced them to travel for 3 days and 3 nights without stopping. Everybody slept in the saddle. They would ride up to the chuck wagon as it was rolling to pick up whatever they had for coffee or food and eat in the saddle. And they went the entire distance in 72 hours. So you can see I did the calculation, makes it about 1 mile an hour, which is about right for cattle that are moving across such a difficult terrain and no water. And you can see here Castle Gap was their first goal, and then over there to the Pecos River at Head of the Concho. I have recently been able to follow the Butterfield Trail exactly by zooming all the way down in Google Earth to the point where I could see the wagon ruts. And I've been able to follow it through this entire area here. And I just recently created a video where it's a flyover following this trail. It's on YouTube now. I've given them the link, and you can bring that up and take a look at it. And you can see that they moved down the long draw here. You can see on the right, this long draw. Then they crossed over to another draw, came up a little ways until they had to cut west, and then they went straight across the open plains there. So when they finished crossing, they came to Castle Gap, which is a gap in the mesas, which is 60 miles across, And so this is the only way to get through this mesa, long line of mesas, to cross through to get to the Pecos River. Everybody had to go through this. The wagon trains, the stagecoach, the cattle drives, the freighters, it didn't matter. Whoever was going to the Pecos had to go through this gap here. And you can see it's a difficult one. On the left, you can see this is an actual artist rendition of one of the men that was with John Russell Bartlett's expedition in 1850. And he drew this as they came out of the gap on the west side, looking back to the east side. And you can see to them, it was quite a sight. Everybody mentioned it in the wagon trains and the cattle drives and everything that had journals. So after they came through the gap, the cattle were starving for water, and they could smell the river 12 miles away. Now, what I've done is I've taken the quotations and I've created a narration so you can read and listen along using this narration here.
As soon as they smelled the cool air, they became wild for water. And when they reached the river, those behind pushed the ones in the lead right on across before they had time to stop and drink. I turned them back, and they readily went in again, drinking as they swam. I returned as quickly as possible to meet Mr. Loving, who held the remainder of the herd, about 500 head. In the meantime, the wind shifted, and as soon as they smelled the water, they became unmanageable. They were virtually crazy and would go either to the water or not at all. The point of the river for which they were headed was like a ditch, with banks from 6 to 10 feet high. When they reached the river, they never halted, but poured right over the bank, and the remainder of the horses went in with them.
So this is the section that he's talking about, from Goodnight's own account. Just to give you a perspective here, when the wagons or would come to cross this river, they would actually come down to this area in the far left, and they would cross back across the river. The river's heading in this direction here, and they would cross back across the river here. But the cattle, this is the straight line from Castle Gap. The cattle just came running straight in, and these banks are still there that he talked about. So I find that really interesting to find a correlation directly from his words to what is actually there. And we're going to continue with his words because this is another interesting thing that I've been able to correlate.
I put them to grass and placed one of the best men, Charlie Wilson, in charge of them, telling him to hold them while they grazed, but not to let them go back to the river for a while. I set out to help the drags, but glancing back, saw 6 cows on their way to the river. The cows stopped at one of the detached, strongly alkaline pools. 3 finished drinking before I could reach them. As they turned away from the water, one after another dropped in her tracks and died.
So here on the right side is the Horsehead Crossing area that I talked about, where they had come down. You can see the trail running down here to the river. So after they got the animals watered, they took them back up to this grazing area up here. So you can see the difference in the land. This is a salty, alkaline type of land in the close into the river. And then it was pretty good grass area back in the day. At that time, it was actually a buffalo range. And I've been able to find exactly those pools that he talked about. They're now just remnants of pools, but you can see the discoloration of these pools that he's mentioning in his account. So they had come from this area, coming back to the water, and stopped at these pools to drink and died from it. So they had to be very careful from that point on to keep their cattle away from these alkaline pools. And these pools actually are not just here, but all up and down the Pecos River. One of the things that I've been able to determine that later the drives, they always, of course, we're passing information back and forth to each other. And there is now a trail that I've been able to discern coming out of the gap, heading to the crossing, that veers away from the wagon road. And I'm pretty sure this is an assumption here, but you can see that the wagon road goes over a pretty ugly rocky area here because they were trying to make a straight shot to the river. And the cattle trails appears to veer off to the right and get over into this area here, starting about right at this location here, to go into grass area and keep them off of that rocky area here. So they moved them out. It also protected the wagon road because you pass 2,000 cattle over a wagon road and you're going to destroy the road. So that looks like what they were doing from that point on, is moving the cattle off to the side, to keep them off the road and to keep them in the grass. Another thing that I've been able to determine is here we're coming from looking at it from a different direction here. And the cattle trail came back and crossed the wagon road here, came down, and then crossed the wagon road again. And then they brought the cattle to a different location crossing to keep them away from this wagon crossing. Because again, you put 2,000 head over and over and over again through a wagon crossing, and you're going to destroy the crossing completely. So they figured out they needed to get the cattle to a different area, and they came and crossed into this area across the river here. But I've always wondered, why did they cross twice? Why didn't they just come down the way they were coming? Well, Goodnight's account tells you why. They wanted to keep those cattle away from those alkaline ponds. And if they brought them straight down here, they would have a hard time keeping those cattle out of those ponds, because they no matter what, they had to cross that desert without any water for the last 3 days. So the best way to do it was keep them as far away until it's time to turn them back and get them down to the river without getting close to those ponds. So that's another interesting thing I've been able to discern from Goodnight's account. Here you can see another image of the same trail crossing to the, deviating away from the wagon trail and crossing over to this area. And this area is a natural corral, a natural trap for the cattle. They could bring them over here. And this is the bend actually comes back around. It's a horseshoe bend. And of course the cattle are just going to want to drink anyway. So it's a good place where they could water the cattle until the cattle were refreshed. And then they could bring them back out across again to the east side and take them up to the grazing range, which is what he said he did. So they followed the same thing, but just in a different location. So after many, many years of following all these trails coming into the Horsehead Crossing area, I've been able to figure out what is going on, because I'm looking at all these vegetation lines that it was hard to understand. The first one to understand was the stagecoach. The stagecoach never crossed the river. They always went up the east side. And this is the breakaway point where the stagecoach headed up the east side. The wagons, which would be wagon trains or freight wagons or something, who had to cross the river, this is the white line, and they came down, as I said, and would turn back in and cross the river at this point. This here on the right is not historic. This is a modern trail. And then we also found recently there was many vegetation circles in the ground that for years and years and years I could not figure out what the heck was going on with these circles. Well, what those were was wagon train circles. The wagon trains would come down, and of course they would circle the wagons, and they would spend time planning and preparing the next day to make the crossing. And those crossings would take all day long, and they had to be very careful depending on the river, whether it was high or low. If it was high, they were going to have to be floating a lot of stuff. If it was low, they had to deal with the mud. So they would circle their wagons, and there are many circles. There's like 7 that I've been able to count. So these are wagon train circles that are determined through vegetation changes. When the wagons use the same thing over and over again, the vegetation pretty much dies away, makes another depression, and then you get those vegetation growths. We now come to the part where the stagecoach station was. Now, in this case, we're again looking from the east side to the west, and the stagecoach would cut across and then go into the next bend up from the Horsehead Crossing area. And they built their station here. Originally, they continued up the east side, going up to Pope's Crossing, which is right now is just below the New Mexico line. We know that this was a station, even though it was pretty well wiped out from flooding, and it was an adobe built station. And of course, the flooding would just wipe that completely away. We know that station was there because we have an 1869 map where they showed the old station in that bend, which matches up here. And then I went over to the station area and flew a drone over to it, and you can see over here that the vegetation is completely different in a rectangular way of where the station used to be. And here you can see on the left side the wagon road leading into the station. It was all their stations were compounds. The front was the living facilities, and the back was the corral area. They would drive directly into the corral area, so they would have protection while they were changing the teams and protection for the passengers in the compound. So this validates everything matches together to the station being at this location. And of all of our studies, they're all on our website in great detail of each one of these places, and have reports, long reports, archaeologically based reports for you. And we'll have the links, I think, available to you afterwards. So another narration, and this one is the Hoy Cattle Drive Indian fight. This is a well-known Indian fight, and this one also was an account given by Charles Goodnight. He wasn't in this fight, but his friend Joel Hoy and his family was. So this is his account that came from that fight.
Hoy gained the pass at Castle Canyon, and his cattle caught scent of the river and stampeded way from his hands. After they had watered, he readily regained control and threw the herd away from the river to graze. A large party of Indians charged them, took the cattle and horses, and wounded 3 men and the valiant Mrs. Hoy, who tended the wounded of others and loaded guns until she was too weak to go on. As the Indians drove the cattle across the river, Hoy placed his wounded in the wagon, and with the vehicle pushed and pulled by men, carried them to refuge in the old adobe walls, the ruins of the Butterfield stage stand. There they were besieged for 3 days. On the 4th, they saw dust rising in the direction of the Castle Gap, and as the Indians raised the siege, crossed the river and took the trail of the herd, Colonel Dalrymple rode up with his men. He had found where the Indians had burned Hoy's wagon and carts in the canyon and had rushed on to discover the fate of the outfit.
So again, we've got the stagecoach station becoming an important place. They weren't actually in the stagecoach station at the time. They were away from it because of, again, grazing the cattle far out from the river. They had to get them back into the grass. And by knowing where the station was and listening to his account, I've been able to find something else. And this is an account from Kate Hoy, who was the daughter in that family and in that fight. And this is her account.
Before the Indians reached us, my father put the children and myself in the wagon and told us to drive down in a gully while they prepared to fight. Mother loaded the guns for the 12 men, while the Indians made an attack on us.
So she's talking about Mother loading the guns. What we're talking about is muskets. That's what she was loading, the muskets. This was too early before the cartridge period. She talks about this gully, and if you look through this area here, there's only one place that was a gully that could be, that a wagon could drive down into, and that is right here. So now we know what she's talking about, and we know the distance. So it's 400 yards that they pushed that wagon to get it over to the station. What happened was the Indians had left them for a period of time to take care of the cattle that they had stolen, the entire herd. And so that gave them the time to get their wounded in the wagon and push that wagon over to this station where they would have adobe walls that they could protect themselves. And then the Indians came back into the fight and put the siege on this station, is what she's talking about. So again, we're using satellite imagery, research papers, accounts to see exactly what we're talking about in these different accounts. And you can see it with your own eyes here now. Before we started, I mentioned about the cattle drive maps. You can see here, every single map that I've been able to find on cattle drives shows that the Goodnight-Loving Trail went up the west side of the Pecos River. And in fact, every one of those is wrong. They went up the east side. Not only the Goodnight, but every single cattle trail from that point on went up the east side of the Pecos River. The only time they crossed over to the west side was later on when they're up in the New Mexico area, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But you can see that all these maps are incorrect. And this is the actual way that they went. Went up the east side here. These are actual watering locations that have been determined through the Goodnight's accounts and Patrick Darren's study from A Cowboy on the Pecos, where he annotated every one of the places where cattle could actually reach the river safely and be watered. And then you can see here, they crossed over to the west side at Pope's Crossing, which is one of the well-known crossings just below the border there. The reason that they crossed here, because on the right side, on the east side here, was sand hills, and they had to avoid the sand hills. So once they crossed past the sand hills, just after Carlsbad, they crossed again to get across the river. Again, the reason being, two reasons actually. One, again, you're talking grass area, and also they would prefer at this area, they preferred to be on the east side because the Apache Indians were all coming from the west side, and they wanted to have at least the river between them and any attacks that might be coming that they could foresee. So in this area, they stayed again on the east side until they got up farther, and then crossed over to the west again to get up to Fort Sumner. So this is the actual trail that should be annotated in maps for the cattle trail. And again, going back to Google Earth, going up from Horsehead Crossing, you can actually still see remnants of the trails. These are the 3 trails that are visible. You can see those lines here, where all these arrows are. Those lines are the different cattle trail remnants as they went up the river on the east side there. You can see they're a quarter mile away from the river out in the grass area. Another reason they stayed on the east side here, if you look even farther up into space and look down, you can see that the west side of the Pecos River is much more damaged of the alkali salt that comes seeping out of the ground all through the Pecos River area here up to New Mexico, heavily on the west side, and not so much on the east side. And especially, you've got the what is now, you can see, is all oil wells and stuff. But back in that day, it was buffalo range, so a lot of grass. This actually became one of the bigger cattle areas in the 1880s up to the 1890 period because of the buffalo range and all the grass. So they had good results, although they had problems. They lost at least 500, probably more, of their head. But they were able to sell their cattle at 8 cents a pound at the time, which was 3 times the price. They got $12,000 in gold from the military at Fort Sumner that had to feed the Indian reservation, is what their requirement, why they needed the cattle so badly. $350,000 worth of gold. And that's not all, because after this, the Loving took the cows and the calves that the military didn't want and ran them up to Denver and sold those. So they made even more money on that one, but they had to divide their resources. And Loving went to Denver, and Loving turned around and went back to Texas to start preparing for another drive. Now, the second drive, they had learned a lot of their lessons, especially the ones about the cattle coming out of the gap to the river, and they didn't lose as many. They met back up in New Mexico, and they wintered outside of Fort Sumner, and then they started selling off the cattle to the Army in smaller groups throughout the entire winter. After they made so much money and the word got around, the drives just started coming one after another. Everybody wanted to do this because they would make 3 times the amount of money, a lot more risk, but 3 times the money. And that was worth the risk to them at that time. To show how many, we've got here a narration from what would be Captain Dodge at Fort Stockton at the time. Oops, sorry. Go back to that.
If the same number of herds are driven over the road this season that have passed in previous years, it would take half a regiment to furnish the required details.
So, again, I was talking about the military escorting to the Pecos. Well, the military was also escorting along the Pecos, and they were out of Fort Stockton. And so they were providing the escorts, and they were overwhelmed because so many cattle drives were running up this Pecos River to Fort Sumner and that area. The Indians quickly found out about it, and the attacks were constant. So it was a big risk for these guys. A lot of them lost their entire herds, at least parts of them, and some of them the entire thing, and some of them lost some of their men. After that, after the Fort Sumner thing, they decided they had to take cattle up to Colorado. And this, when I talked about Loving going up to Denver, we have the trail going up from Fort Sumner, and he decided to use a trail that went along the Pecos over to Las Vegas, New Mexico, and then up to Raton Pass, and then through the pass into Colorado. That was his way. That pass is a very narrow pass. It's a difficult pass. I know this area very well. I travel there quite a bit. I have property. If you look the top left here where my arrow is, that I have property right about that location here. So it was a difficult pass. So what happened was on the next year, Goodnight decided he didn't want to take this kind of roundabout route, and he created a new route that went straight up after they got through this mountain, this canyon area, went straight up to Capulan area, and then cut over to Raton. And this is the sign at Capulan of the crossing of the Goodnight-Loving Trail there. One of the problems was that when he got to the top of the pass that next year, this guy named Uncle Dick Wooten had established a toll station at the summit and forced Goodnight to have to pay 10 cents a head for the passage over the summit, which obviously didn't go well with Goodnight. He was pretty upset, but he was stuck. He had to pay the price. And he said he would never do that again. Obviously, 10 cents a head is pretty steep back in those days. I've been able to determine the route that he took to get up to Capulan. And here we've got at Fort Sumner, starting down here, came up through here. He had to go around this area of canyons and draws and everything to make his way up to the Canadian crossing. And then there was only one way to get up to the plains, literally one way, and it had to go through here. So we'll zoom in on that and take a look at that. So it's documented that he straightened out the trail, and he went crossing that was 20 miles west of Fort Bascom. And here's Fort Bascom, here's the 20 miles. So here's the crossing point. And just by using terrain analysis, this is absolutely the point that has to be crossed if you've got a large herd of cattle. And I'll show you why here. Here's the area going up to the plains here that I mentioned. So here is a zoomed in picture of the cattle crossing area. One of the reasons that this cattle crossing area is going in and coming out, there's a nice, easy way to get up this one little mesa here on this side, and obviously it's going in is pretty good here. And what is, let me see here if I can, okay. Let's see if I can, oh no. The picture of everybody is blocking the, let's see if I can move this here, move this down. Oh no. So here's the narration for this part.
After crossing the Canadian, Goodnight pointed the herd a short day's drive to the foot of an abrupt mesa, which still goes by the name of Goodnight Hill. They raised the mesa by a trail directly up its face, an elevation of some 700 feet in a quarter of a mile.
You can see the old trail. And the reason that this trail is so obvious is because it wasn't just Goodnight. Everybody started following his trail after that too. So this trail is very well run, and you can see that this is a fence line here. The trail runs through the fence line, so that tells you that the trail was before the fence was made. And then it follows pretty much where this road goes here. And then when it gets up to this point, again, based on his account, it goes straight up. And that's what follows this. The ranch road obviously was created to make an easier way up. But this is the way they went up, and then followed what the ranch road is now, and then through this little gap right here up into the plains. So again, we're talking about going up into the plains here at the bottom of the image, and then he went up to Capulan. At Capulan, he decided to go through a different pass, and he scouted out and found Tinchira Pass. And I've actually gone through Tinchira Pass to check it out. And here's the images that I took by drone of the pass. And you can see this is a really nice pass. It was an easy way through that nobody knew about at the time until he made the first drive through this pass. This is looking from the south back up to the top of the pass here, and this is looking from the north side into the pass into Colorado. On the right side here, you can see they have a museum there, and this buffalo robe is in the museum, and the robe was given by Goodnight to Gladys King as a gift of appreciation. And you can see here, this is the King Lake. Today, I think this is not, there's no water there, but this King Lake, and that's where he would water his cattle, and they gave him permission. And also, it shows that she drove him to Taos, New Mexico, and this was a gift of appreciation for that. Then you've got a third drive the next year, and during that year, the Cattle Association restricted, all these different counties were restricted from having longhorn cattle come through their area because they were worried about the tick fever. So all of his previous trails up through to Denver and area here were restricted. So what he did was he made another trail. And when he got up, here's Fort Sumner on the bottom, and he went straight up again, and then he cut east across here, a new trail, 320-mile trail up to Granada in the far eastern side of Colorado over here. So he could now bring his cattle and sell his cattle up in an area that was not restricted by the tick fever restrictions of the other counties. So that was his third year drive. And finally, the one last narration here.
Oliver Loving died on the third cattle drive famously reenacted in the fictional movie series Lonesome Dove, which was somewhat based on the lives of Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving. Subsequent trail drives by Goodnight made it all the way up to Colorado and Wyoming and helped start ranches in the new Western Territories. Goodnight continued to carry Loving as a partner in the business for the next 2 years, sending half the proceeds to Loving's family.
And that's talking about what is depicted in the Lonesome Dove series when Oliver Loving was attacked. He was supposed to be going up ahead of the drive to get to Fort Sumner and get the contracts were being let. And he was supposed to stay run only at night. And he got anxious and thought they hadn't had any trouble. So he decided, well, let's just go the daytime. And sure enough, the Apache saw them coming up, attacked them from the west. They ran back to the river, and that's what the Lonesome Dove shows pretty accurately, that they were stuck at the river for a while. He was shot by an arrow, and his partner had to walk, snuck out, walked back. He stayed there, but he couldn't get away. A few more days, he went upriver. He snuck upriver and was rescued and ended up at Fort Sumner and died of the gangrene from the wound. A couple of last things to show you. This depiction is a collaboration that I worked with Mike Capron. This is the Goodnight-Loving Trail. He was actually commissioned to do a Goodnight-Loving Trail painting outside of San Angelo for a business in San Angelo. And so since I had worked that area, I helped him understand the area, showed him the area, and here you've got the Middle Concho River here in the background. And this is from all of the work we did together. Since then, we've worked on 4 more paintings. So this is one of the only time that I know of that archaeology and artists have worked together to depict accurately information into their artist paintings. And we have a very good relationship with Mike. Finally, to show you some of the projects that we have worked and are working. Here is the whole list. We have 4 ongoing projects right now. We're still working them all. We're heading out pretty soon, in fact, next week, on another reconnaissance. And all of our reporting is on a website. You can download any of these reports in PDF form to get the full information of the work that we did. They're extensive, every one of them, and have very thoroughly researched. So those will be available to anybody. We also ask if anybody's interested. On the website, you can join as a member with no cost. If you're just interested in keeping up with our work, go ahead and send us a membership, or even just as easy as sending me an email, and we'll put you on the list for all of our newsletters and announcements of reports and stuff like that. And also we will announce when we have field work available for volunteers. And that is the end of my presentation.
Wow, Tom, thank you so much. That's remarkable. Incredible amount of content and extremely well researched. Thanks to Lonnie. There are links in the chat, both to the West Texas Archaeological Society and some of the YouTube videos, the Google Earth videos. Any quick questions for Tom?
So to get into your videos, you said you were going to give us a link, or how do we get into those?
On the
Yeah,
website,
in the chat.
we have the links on our website for videos, reports. We have photograph section, so you can get them straight off the website, and it hooks back into YouTube.
So that's the West Texas. What is the website is what I'm asking.
It's West, all one word. Let me go back to this here. On the bottom here, all one word, West Texas Archaeological Society .website.
Okay.
Instead of a .com or .org, it's .website. And one more thing that I mentioned earlier a little bit, we support the annual Horsehead Crossing event. It's a pretty big deal. On that, some of those videos you can see our event where we're now bringing in the Comanche, the Apache, the Humano Indians. Last year, we had 7 chuck wagons cooking all at the same time. We had stagecoach. We have my presentations, the history, where I go into a little bit more depth of some of the stuff that's not directly related to the cattle drive stuff. And we have reenactors come to set up camps of different types, and we bring in the cannons from the military. It's a pretty big event. So it's open camping. It's all free, including the food. It's 2 days of camping and enjoying this crazy place out in the middle of nowhere.
And Margaret, I don't know if you can access the chat, but in the chat, there's a link for the YouTube videos. It should take you directly to the YouTube videos, as well as the West Texas Archaeological Society website. And
I have a question.
Go ahead, please.
I have a question. Did they figure out how to prevent the cattle from stampeding with the smell ever?
Yes, I think part of that was, first of all, they learned how to hold the cattle at the gap. And I think part of that trail going off to the right to keep them in the grass probably had something to do with keeping them in the grass. And then it's just a matter of technique of learning where to place their guys to keep the cattle from running off.
Thanks.
It's learning the hard way, I'll tell you.
Yeah. These were very, very skilled men, and they knew how to. They had so many stampedes. Of course, they were always dealing with stampedes, so they started learning pretty quickly how to get these things slowed down and turned and whatever.
One of the exciting things about this for me is that this authentic, significant history has translated. I see Bob Saul nodding his head, and I was just going to see if Bob had a thought about this. This is translated into economic development. I mean, people who are willing to pay money and learn about this and, benefit the economy as well as value this history.
What we are learning is that if we can get this out in the public, if we can advertise it, promote it, so many people are interested in the trails, but the trails over the years have become a Sunday afternoon ride in the park. And that's not what a trail is. A trail is an economic enterprise. And these towns all along the trail were started because of the trails. And the type work that Tom and his partners have done, and Tom has been a wonderful colleague of ours, and we've been fortunate to be able to just be present with him in some of this, and he's doing the kind of work that we need done all along these historic trails. Trails are more than just the past. So it's also the fact that it is the cattle industry, it's the grazing culture, it's the concept of going west, and this vast land that was cleared of the buffalo, and the ranches sprang up. The ranches are still there today, and we need to be able to help people understand that history is not something in a book. History is something that lives, and many, as Tom said earlier, many of the landowners do not even know the trail goes across their land, and many of them are afraid or concerned that if they find it out and anybody else finds out, that it'll be a problem. It needs to be done correctly, but this is where education comes in and involving a large number of people. And I am just so appreciative of Tom and his work and the work of the archaeological societies and what they do to bring that side of scientific history to the ground and out of the ground. And that's what makes it real. But
Absolutely.
I would also invite everybody down to the Horsehead Crossing celebration, where Tom is a major part of that, and he takes you on a walking tour. And let me tell you, that's something else, because he's been over it a lot, and he's always discovering something new. So this coming October, come down to Horsehead Crossing and go on the walking tour with Tom.
And we want to hear more about that. I know we're past our time boundary for today, but let's give Tom at least a virtual round of applause for a really remarkable presentation, and hope we can learn more. Lonnie Steben, what's on tap for our next Cattle Trails showcase?
Well, I might explain something. We actually started out this program looking for a program on Horsehead Crossing celebration, Bob. But after we talked to Tom, we realized the work that's being done there is so important to everybody that has an interest in it. We decided to go ahead with this presentation today. So we'd like to get back to another program later on about Horsehead Crossing. But what we've got lined up for next month is, and there'll be some probably not agree with this statement, but we are going to go to a Kansas town that holds itself out as being the first Kansas cow town before the cattle drives ever came to Abilene. And there's a lot of history in that community, and the Black Dog Trail, where mineral waters, where they had the healing waters for the Indians of the time of Native Americans at that particular location, and back into middle Kansas, where they would travel to these mineral waters. And so we're going to be visiting with the museum in Baxter Springs, and Murray Billington is going to take us on an exploration of some of the historic things around Baxter Springs, which I might add include Route 66, and Mickey Mantle was there for a period of time. So it's going to be a little different, but there's a lot of history there that makes it an interesting visit.
So we'll be headed to the Shawnee Trail for that. I believe President of the International Chisholm Trail Association, Dennis Katzmeyer, has sent word that we're going to have a ICTA board immediately following this. So everyone is welcome to join us for that. For now, please mark your calendars for Friday, February 14. It's Valentine's Day, but it's also the next Cattle Trails Showcase. So until next time, this is Ron Wilson, Poet Laureate, saying thanks for taking time to join us in this place, and come on back next month for our Cattle Trails Showcase. Happy trails, everyone.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
All right.
Thank you, Tom.